Good day, everyone. I'm Dina Wachtel with the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University. And together with my colleague Ayala and David and the rest of our team, it is our pleasure to welcome you to this webinar series titled In Conversation with Ambassador Ido Aharoni, featuring international friends of Hebrew University. Ambassador Aharoni is a global distinguished professor at NYU. He has served 25 years at Israel's Foreign Service, a public diplomacy specialist, and a well-known nation branding practitioner. Today's conversation is with Professor Gil Troy, discussing international affairs and North American Jewry. If you would like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A text box. If you would like to learn more about CFHU and our activities across the country, contact us. You can find us at cfhu.org. We look forward to engaging a conversation with you. And now, please welcome Ambassador Ido Aharoni.
Thank you so much, Dina, for this very, very kind introduction. And thank you for you and Ayala and the rest of the wonderful team for putting together this incredible series. This is a second of 5 sessions, and we're honored and privileged to have with us a clarion voice when it comes to Israel, to North American Jewry, to presidential history, as you will hear in a minute. Professor Gil Troy, I've known him for many, many years. I was always impressed with the clarity of his thought, and we are really blessed and privileged to have him with us. I know that many of you know him. Although he was born in Queens, New York, he spent many, many years in Canada, and I guess very familiar to Canadian audiences. But let me please share with you a little bit of his incredible biography here. Professor Gil Troy is an American presidential historian and a popular commentator on politics, Zionism, Israel, as well as other issues. He's a professor of history at McGill University and a 2015 visiting scholar at the Brookings Institute. Troy is the author of 9 books and the editor of 2. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Daily Beast, the Jerusalem Post, and so on. As I mentioned, he was born in Queens, but he received all of his academic degrees, bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD from Harvard University, where he taught from 88 to 1990. And since 1990, he's teaching history at McGill University. He's a prominent activist in the debate over Zionism and the future of Israel, which is a big question. We will talk about that today. And he has been a Hartman Center Research Fellow, helped found the center's Engaging Israel program. Professor Gil Troy, thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's an honor, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. You're a hero. So to get such a warm introduction is a real honor.
Thank you. And this is perfect timing for us, right? Perhaps one of the most hotly debated presidential elections, and here we have a presidential historian. So before we jump into the issue of Israel, North American Jewry, the future of Zionism, which are all very, very interesting questions. We know you prepared a few slides for us to shed some more light about this unique election campaign. So why don't we jump right into the question of what just happened?
Who knows? Right, everybody's trying to figure that out. It's been really quite the adventure. Look, I'll say with the most exciting thing is the system worked. Think about it. Even the day before the election, everybody was saying there was going to be violence. Shopkeepers were boarding up their windows. And on election day, it seems that as many as 158 million Americans from across this vast continent voted, and voted peacefully. And well, there certainly were hiccups along the way, and we still don't have a president who's gotten the memo that he lost. The numbers suggest pretty authoritatively that Joe Biden is a president-elect. This isn't some media delusion. In 2000, there was a really close election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. One state, which was the determining state, and ultimately it was 537 votes that determined it. Here we're seeing a situation where 5 states authoritatively now are in the Biden column that really gave him the estimate of 306 votes. And I just want to go into three very quick directions. So first of all, everybody talks about red versus blue America. And we divide it by states. But when we actually ask for an analysis by county, we start seeing something very different. That America isn't so much defined by geography, but it's defined, now I'm cheating, and I'm taking some maps from 2016, but the patterns were very much the same. What do we start seeing? It's not about red states, blue states. It's about cities, which are the centers of blue America, even in the South, even in the West, and the vast out there. And so somebody made a map of Trump's America and Clinton's America, and you see the difference. Some people have said, well, no, actually, the United States is more divided into the Deep South, New France, Great Appalachia, the Midlands, the Far West. Some said, wait a minute, it's really time to have this division. Now, by the way, red-blue comes simply from the election map of 2000, that it was the map that ABC News and Washington Post used, and red just happened to be the Republican Party, and blue happened to be the Democratic Party. It has no deep significance, but it took on a kind of powerful meaning. And some people, this goes back to 2004 when George W. Bush was elected, say, you know what? This is what we need. The United States of Canada and Jesus land. Those are the two divisions. So the takeaway is this, that yes, there are some deep divisions within the United States, but there also are overlaps. I tried to look at, okay, red America is supposedly anti-abortion, more conservative. Well, what about their behavior? The divorce rate, the abortion rate, premarital sex rate in red America and blue America, the same. Hollywood movies are popular in red America and blue America, the same. And now we see also that it's not this geographic thing, but it's also partially a lifestyle thing. So that's the first takeaway.
What do you foresee happening? Is Trump's strategy of trying to discredit the process, do you see any chance of it working?
I'm a historian. I always say it's hard enough to predict the past. I can't begin to predict the future, especially in this crazy period. But it seems all the tea leaves are saying this, that, everybody knows, and part of the reason why we go back to this very powerful map, right, is because the Electoral College. And so in mid-December, the Electoral College will meet. And Republicans are starting to indicate that that's when they're going to say, you know what, enough is enough. And so it's very unfortunate. I have to say that the two most damaging things, you can love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump. That's not the point. And I certainly have a lot of compliments to give Donald Trump when we start talking about Israel policy. But the two most damaging things that this president of the United States has done, if you ask me, are in the first debate, he said he wouldn't recognize the electoral results. And indeed, he kept to his word. And that lack of grace, that lack of commitment to the democratic process and the legitimacy of the democratic process is very problematic. And but it's working, because what he's doing is he's keeping himself relevant. Right now, typically, after Bill Clinton won, we stopped talking about George H.W. Bush. We talked Clinton. After Barack Obama won, we stopped talking George W. Bush. We talked Obama. And now we're still talking Trump. And he has kept the focus on him. This has been going on since 2015. And the challenge for Joe Biden, every time he gets more people talking about Biden and Biden-Harris and not about Donald Trump, he's able to build up his stock. And the more Donald Trump keeps the focus on him, the more the nation will be divided.
Now, you made a very valid point about the urbanization of the United States. I believe that in 2016, Hillary Clinton won in 85 of the top 100 cities in America. And it still wasn't enough for her to win the Electoral College. The question is that I would like to ask you, what do you think is the future of this coalition of minorities that everybody's talking about as the power that will rule United States politics going into the future? I've heard many voices from American commentators that saying, where is the blue wave? We didn't see a major blue wave in these elections. African Americans voted for Trump more than they did in 2016. He got more of the gay vote. He got more of the suburban female vote. He got more of the Latino vote. The Democrats were unable to flip, not to flip even one state legislator. They lost seats in the House of Representatives. They weren't able to win over the Senate and so on. So what do you think is the reason for that? They're very strong in urban centers, yet there was no major blue wave.
I think there were three things going on. One is that Trump's popularity was underappreciated and undercounted. I think there was a hidden Trump vote. I think there were many people who were ashamed of their support for Donald Trump because of the way he was bashed in the media and because, frankly, of the ugliness of much of his rhetoric. And so, lo and behold, in the privacy of the voting booth, they went with Trump. That's number one. On the other hand, counter trend is indeed, as you say, America is becoming much more multicultural, much more multi-ethnic. In the 6 congressional seats that Democrats lost, they lost them to Republican women or Republican women of color or Republican candidates, males of color. The Republican Party has finally started getting the memo that the United States of America is fundamentally changing. And if it's only going to be the party of white males, it's not going to win. Now, people look at this chart, especially my Democratic friends, and go, oh my goodness, how could it be that 12% of African Americans, 32% of Latinos, 31% of Asians would vote for Trump? After all, we know he's a racist, he's a demagogue. I actually think that's good news. It's good news in 2 ways. One, a society is healthy if you can't reduce everybody to stereotypes. A society is healthy if it's not polarized along religious and ethnic and racial lines. A society is healthy if there are cross-cutting alliances. And while, again, there are certain signs of ill health in America today, I think the Latinos, for example, sent a memo to the Democratic Party that the whole language of anti-racism, which assumes that every single person of color only sees the United States of America as inherently, irredeemably racist, that the anti-racist 1619 woke approach, which says, no, we don't celebrate 1776, we focus on 1619 where the first slave ship came, misses the fact that most immigrants come to the country not to fight the big political fight, but to get ahead. It's the story of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents in the United States and in Canada. And so to the extent that Latinos, Asians, and even African Americans say, hey, wait a minute, look, I've got my problems with Trump, but you know what? I'm okay economically. I'm okay with my personal story. And I resent being boxed in and only seen by my color, only seen by my ethnic background. That's not American. And I think that's a very important conversation we have to have. The opposite of anti-racism sometimes is racism, but sometimes it's liberal. And we're forgetting.
What you're saying is very interesting. What you're saying is that those forces within the Democratic Party that describe themselves as progressive are actually regressive.
Absolutely. And we know that as soon as the Democratic caucus met right after Election Day, a number of Democratic members of Congress said, don't use that phrase defunding the police anymore. Don't use that phrase socialism anymore. And they said, don't fight those culture wars. That's not American. And that's how we lose. And of course, there was a backlash. And what was the backlash? Someone like Rashida Tlaib said, you're silencing me. You're silencing women. You're silencing African Americans. You're silencing LGBTQ people. Why can't we have a conversation that's a real substantive debate? Why can't she say, you know, I disagree, socialism is good, or I want to defund the police? Why immediately go to that kind of bullying? We see totalitarian bullying on the right, I'm sorry to say, these days, and we see totalitarian bullying, the cancel culture on the left. Both are unacceptable, and both indeed are regressive, and it shows the world is round. That's where the far right and the far left meet. They also meet on anti-Semitism, but we'll get to that later.
Now, you studied the history of American politics. To what extent do you think technology is responsible for this polarization of the political conversation?
I think is a central point. Look, the world that I grew up in the 1960s and 70s and 80s was the 3-channel universe: ABC, NBC, CBS, Walter Cronkite, Leave It to Beaver, Beverly Hillbillies, even Archie Bunker. We all watched more or less the same things. Now, there were problems with it because it very much was admittedly a white male middle class perspective. But it was consensus building. The media was consensus building. The media had these kind of forces that brought us together. Today we live in the age of Twitter dumb, and I spell Twitter dumb, not D-O-M, but D-O-M-B. We reduce everything to short, shrill bursts. We hear and we're bullied by the people on the far left, on the far, and on the far right. And so technology also, what happens? I used to also open up a newspaper. Remember those things? And I'd want to read, let's say, an article about Israel, but inevitably I'm on the foreign policy page and my peripheral vision catches something about Greece or about Russia, and I'm broadened. I go on the op-ed page and I read something that's maybe to the right, but all of a sudden it also, another one next to it brings me to the left. Today, the logarithms go in my head and they say, oh, Troy, you want to read this, so I'm going to get you this and this and this, and I'm going to send you deeper and deeper and deeper into your left wing or right wing hole. I'm going to send you deeper and deeper into your pro-Israel or anti-Israel hole. I'm going to send you deeper and deeper into Trump world or Biden world. That's dangerous. So technology is definitely a problem.
You mentioned Trump's foreign policy, especially Middle Eastern policy. No question, he was a disruptor. Question one, do you agree with the description of him as a disruptor? And number two, what was the disruption he brought to the Middle East?
Well, so this will be our final slide. Let's just take a quick look and we see that overwhelmingly Jews voted for Biden, 68%, 30%. Some estimates were even higher for Biden and lower for Trump. But in Florida, some estimates suggest that as many as 40% of the Jews voted for Donald Trump, and Trump won Florida. How could that be? This gets to the heart of your question. And 40% of Florida Jews are not conservative and are not Orthodox, lowercase key politically conservative, lowercase c, or Orthodox. What was going on? There is a significant number of Jews who said, yes, he was a disruptor and a very constructive disruptor in the Middle East in three extremely dramatic ways. One, Iran, Iran, Iran. They didn't buy Obama's desire to engage with the mullahs. They were fearful not only of the JCPOA, the Iranian treaty, when it was being negotiated. And some of us, I said, all John Kerry has to do is throw over the table once, walk out once dramatically. And not only will he get a better deal, but he'll make himself more popular. And they didn't do it. And it wasn't only that we don't fully trust our Iranian brothers and sisters, we should say their government, when it comes to respecting the nuclear limits on them. But we know, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, Ido, that tens of millions of dollars were pumped, American dollars, that were sent to Iran, were pumped to Hezbollah, were pumped to Hamas, were pumped to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, were pumped to the worst actors in the Middle East to destabilize the Middle East. So Trump coming in, freezing the Iran treaty, putting economic sanctions on Iran was to many Jews and many intelligent people a good thing, number one. Number two, symbolically, the recognition of Jerusalem. And whose idea was that? This goes back to Jimmy Carter's platform. This goes back to George McGovern's platform in 1972. Democrats and Republicans called for it. Donald Trump did it. And the third, of course, most exciting, is the Abraham Accords. And I really hope, there's a tendency when you come in as a new president, you look at the previous president's foreign policy, if it's of a different party, and you become the un-Trump, you become the un-Obama, you become the un-Bush. I really hope that Joe Biden's team is sitting and saying, you know what, we're going to distance ourselves from Donald Trump. But what did he know that we didn't know? What did he do that broke out of the box of the perpetual peace processors? What did he do? Because we know, I'm a historian, I'm not allowed to say if, but if Hillary Clinton had been president, very few people believe that there would have been an Abraham Accords. There probably would have been just ink, lots and lots of ink about stalemate in the Middle East. And as far as I'm concerned, every state that makes peace with Israel is a plus. That's peace now. And the excitement that's going on, because it's a bottom-up kind of peace, culturally, diplomatically. I can't tell you in my neighborhood how many people are talking about, when am I going to go? Either as a tourist or as a business person or cultural or academic ties. What an amazing thing. And that is Donald Trump's achievement. And that's an achievement that Joe Biden should build on, and that would show true leadership.
Now, what's your projection, by the way, talking about the Biden administration? What in his decisions will give us the indication as to the direction? what's going to be the significance of appointing Susan Rice, for example, as opposed to, let's say, Tony Blinken?
So there are three things. First of all, so much of what revolves around America politically now is now not about December 14th when the electors meet, but January 5th when the Georgia voters meet. And I think many of the key decisions, including probably whether or not Susan Rice is appointed to a position that has to go to before the Senate for advice and consent, will be determined by whether the Democrats get those 2 wins in Georgia, which will then give them a 50-50 split. And because of Vice President Harris, the heroine of Westmount High, we have to put a little Canadian content into this. Whether if they have the 50, she gives the 1, they will be able to vote many people in. So this is going to be the interesting thing of the tea leaves. It's not only a matter of what Joe Biden wants, but what he can pull off given the political dynamics. And we'll really know what the political dynamics will be in the short term on January 5th. So that's one dimension of it. The second dimension of it is, James Carville in 1992 famously said, it's the economy, stupid. Right now, we know it's the economy coronavirus, stupid. That we are very concerned about foreign policy, but Joe Biden knows that his legacy is going to be determined by how he manages the economy, how he manages the coronavirus, and how he manages what he calls the return to the soul of America. Those are the 3 priorities. Foreign policy will necessarily take a back step. But indeed, as you well know, and you probably should be the one answering the questions on this part more than me, it's very significant whether it's Susan Rice or Tony Blinken. It's very significant whether Joe Biden goes to someone like Chris Coons, his good colleague from a good colleague who's the senator from Delaware, and a good friend of his who's a strong supporter of the state of Israel. Now, let's be very careful with our language. I don't want any critic of the Biden administration Middle East policy, and there will be, that prediction I'll make, to use the phrase anti-Israel. You want to say they're hard on Israel? They might be. You want to say they're anti-settlement? They might be. You want to say they don't get it? They might not get it. But it's so foolish, it's so immature, it's so destructive of us when we take people like Joe Biden, and I know I'm going to annoy some people on this phone call, and Barack Obama, and we use the phrase anti-Israel, and in so doing, clump them with people like Sai Barakat, or people like, unfortunately, many of my colleagues on McGill campus and University of Toronto campus and campuses, NYU campus, who are truly anti-Israel, who truly want to destroy the Jewish people, who truly don't give us the right to exist. Why boost those numbers? So we need a new language. You want to call them PPP, perpetual peace processors. You want to call them even bash Israel firsters. Come up with a different language. But this reductive, simplistic, idiotic, and destructive to us as Jews language of anti-Israel versus pro-Israel, throw it out the window. Except for somebody who's truly earned that ugly distinction. The anti-Semitic anti-Zionists, the Xenophobes, call them anti-Israel, call them out, but don't blur the case by taking a politician who, like Barack Obama, came to Herzl's grave and he validated the Jewish story. He validated our rights to the land. And I say this as someone who criticized his final UN vote, right? I can criticize him, but also see that he wasn't anti-Israel. I disagree with him politically, policy-wise.
Now, you mentioned the situation on campus, and I know that this is of great concern to many of our listeners. I teach at NYU, you teach at McGill. We know that there are pockets of we will call it pockets of resistance to Israel's very right to exist in places like York University and University of Toronto and Concordia, and in the United States, in many campuses. Are you worried about that?
Yes, look, I'm a case of arrested development. I got to university and I never left. I love the university, right? You were in the real world and then you came to the university. So you're a late in life lover of the university, returning perhaps to your first love. It's so painful that when we talk about the universities, we don't immediately think about what courses are our young students going to take. We don't think about the open culture of inquiry, of critical thought, of books that I was initiated into, that you were initiated into when we studied. And instead, we worry about our students, our young people being bullied. We worry about our students, our young people being canceled. We worry about our students, our young people being told that the two pillars on which we've built a 3,500-year-old story of Jewishness and Jewish identity and Jewish history, which is our nationalism and our religion, are going to be mocked and now seen as Trumpian. It's a disaster. Now, I picked up on your language, and I agree with you. Not every university is like that. Not every classroom is like that. Not every professor is like that, right? And we have to acknowledge that there are pockets that are like that and pockets that are not. But unfortunately, it's spreading. And unfortunately, through the increasing woke nature of the university, through these things that I was mentioning earlier about 1619 and anti-racism, which start with very good ideas, but become so fanatic, they kind of bring the anti-Israelism, and that is truly anti-Israelism, along in their wake. And the haters use the language of human rights and use the language of African-American solidarity and use the language of racism as a cloak to come in and bash us. And the fact that there's so much anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism on campus today, the fact that we somehow have to say, oh, let's prove how they are anti-Semitic. My gay friends don't have to sit there proving when somebody's homophobic. My African-American friends don't have to sit there and prove when somebody's racist. My feminist friends don't have to prove when somebody's being an anti-feminist. They have to prove that they're not being anti-Semitic. The burden of proof is on them, not on me, sir. And you, of course, know that.
Now, what would you say is the most effective way to deal with this? Israel, for a brief moment, was celebrated almost in intellectual circles. It's no longer the case for many, many years. What do you think is the solution to the problem? Is it related to the academic teachings first, or is it something that related to the climate on campus?
So I think we have to look at it from two different perspectives. First, the most important, most effective way to solve the problem of Israel on campus. Everybody always yells at me and says, what about the students? And you know what I say? What about the parents? Let's do some Pilates Judaism and Pilates Zionism. If our kids come on campus with a strong, proud Jewish identity, if they've learned from you, the branding king, what it is to be proud of being Jewish, being proud of being Israeli, that Israel isn't, I'm quoting you, a fort, right? But is a home. If we start with an understanding of what Zionism is, if we send our kids, whether you send the kids to Jewish day schools or not, that's not the issue. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about having a sense of a strong core, of pride. You come in, you've solved half the problem. Because if I have a strong sense of Jewish identity, a strong sense of Zionist identity, and a strong sense of pride and dignity, when you attack me, I may decide to respond or may not decide to respond, but I'm not going to crumble. Too many of our kids crumble because what we've told them is that the university is the most important thing in the world. What we've told them is that they don't have that sky-high GPA and that ideal CV and write that silly essay about how they are masters of the universe and NYU or McGill or Harvard has to take them, and if they don't, the world is going to collapse, and their world does collapse when they don't get accepted. Then they come in worshiping the false gods. So first, this is what I call identity Zionism, and you've called so effectively rebranding. Start with a core. And then, yes, look, we've got a problem because it's been weaponized. And because anti-Israelism is coming as part of a broader story, we have to attack the broader issue. And the broader issue is this. I call it educational malpractice. That too many professors think that the university is not a place for open inquiry, but a place to advance their political platform. And that is a sin against their students, against the university, and against humanity.
That's a very profound point that you're making. You know, David Ben-Gurion famously said that 1860 is the year where practical Zionism started. In his view, that was the year when the Jews left the old city. Moshe Montefiore created Yemin Moshe, and indeed, until this very day, when we count our dead, we count them from 1860. When you on Yom HaZikaron, on Israel Remembrance Day for the fallen, we count our dead since 1860. Now, when you look at the trajectory Zionism has made since 1860, where would you locate us now? Is it a high point? Is it a low point? Where in the trajectory are we right now?
It's a great question. Look, let's talk about three highs. High number one was 1948, right? The first move starting in 1860, even in some ways starting with Avraham Avinu, and certainly with the exile after the Second Temple was destroyed, was we need a state. We need to save Jewish bodies, right? We need to establish that state. That was the first oomph of Zionism, Zionism 1.0. But even then, when I came out with my book, The Zionist Ideas, I looked for the perfect statement of a normal Zionist, of a Zionist who just wanted to be a normal country. And they all said that, but many of them said it, but at the end of the day, the power of Jewish ideas, the power of Jewish idealism is so great, it's so volcanic that it always bursts forth. So inevitably, there'd be idealism wrapped up in the realism. There'd be some talk of the Jewish soul as well as the Jewish body. So that was 1.0. Then 1967, especially if we talk in American terms and Canadian terms and diaspora terms, Abraham Joshua Heschel has this great line. He said, from 1948 to 1967, we took Israel for granted. We took this miracle for granted. We became so used to the Tel Aviv Hilton that we forgot Tel Chai. We became so used to swimming in Tel Aviv, if the few of us who got there and we heard the stories, that we forgot the heroism required. In 1967, when there was a fear that Israel might be destroyed, was a shock to the system. And people from that generation knew that gave this amazing push. And that was a kind of new kind of Zionism, a Zionism that became more worldwide, that especially the American diaspora and the Canadian diaspora, and Canadians, of course, were always more instinctively Zionist than Americans, because they were a little less Canadian than the Americans, if I can make trouble. They felt a little less at home. Said, wow, this is really a worldwide movement. Right now, Zionism 3.0 is at a moment of tremendous crisis and tremendous opportunity. 20 years ago, only 20% of American Jews had been to Israel. The Canadian numbers were always higher, 50 and 60%, even then. Thanks to Birthright, thanks to Masa, thanks to Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, which sends students on Year in Israel program, on junior abroad, thanks to all these amazing initiatives, which are real partnerships between Israeli institutions and Israeli thought leaders and American institutions, American thought leaders, and American philanthropists. Over 50% of American Jews have visited Israel. And we're now in this age of what I call identity Zionism. We're now in an age where more and more people are understanding, hey, wait a minute. My connection to Israel isn't just to write a check. It's not just to defend the Jewish people. It's also to find meaning. The late Jonathan Sachs had a wonderful expression. He said, now Israel is world Jewry's classroom. And we come to Israel, whether for Aliyah or for 10 days, or for a bar mitzvah trip, or for a Year in Israel trip, or for the Hebrew University Board of Governors meeting, or whatever, we come and we taste of Israel, and we get that boom, that zest, that shock, that excitement, that swimming in 3D, 24/7, 365-day Judaism that can keep us sustained. That's back when we had this thing called travel, and I look forward to travel being a verb again. And so we have a partnership now that we didn't have before. And that's a tremendous opportunity with all the anti-Zionism and all the headaches on campus.
I could not agree with you more. However, we do see the tension between universalism in Judaism and particularism in Judaism, and Israel, in the eyes of many, is becoming more and more ethnocentric, more detached from the global agenda. For example, climate change is not a big issue in Israel. And the question that I'd like to pose to you is, what do you see Israel's responsibility in this equation? Because you described beautifully what North American Jewry did in order to better connect with Israel. And you gave the historical trajectory. But the question is, what do you think Israel should do in order, on its part, in order to strengthen the connection?
In any relationship, when we start with the finger pointing, we forget that one of the fingers is pointed at us. And American Jews have been very, very good, more so than Canadian Jews, but we're starting to hear this more and more in Canadian Jewry too, have been very good at finger pointing at Israel. Oh, because of Bibi. Oh, because of the settlements. Oh, because of your ethnocentrics. I'm disappointed in you. And Israelis have been very good at saying, well, you reforming, you don't care, you're a true universalist, you've assimilated. We've got to stop this language. We've got to take responsibility, each one of us, and understand, by the way, part of the reason why we get on each other's nerves so much at this period is because each of us realize how much we need one another in a very profound way. Israelis understand that there's no better partner in fighting the delegitimization of Israel than our fellow Canadian Jews, our fellow American Jews, our fellow Jews all over the world. And American Jews, Canadian Jews, British Jews, Australian Jews, French Jews understand that there's no better partner in building Jewish identity, in using that Jewish classroom than our Israeli brothers and sisters. So because of that, we care about the Kotel in a different way. Because of that, we care about, Israelis. Why should Israelis care about what's going on an American campus? Why does it hurt them if there's a boycott on NYU campus? Really think about it, right? It's happening 6,000 miles away, but it's because we're interconnected. And so that means that we have to take responsibility. And taking responsibility means, yes, Israelis have to say, look, I know most Israelis don't really care that much about the Western Wall, about access to the Western Wall. I'll be even more controversial. I've looked at the birthright numbers. Most birthright participants, when they come to the Kotel, they don't care whether it's egalitarian or not. That's an issue of their rabbis and of the elites. They respond to the Western Wall as the spiritual highlight of their trip, the spiritual highlight of their lives. Nevertheless, there are many, many Canadian American Jews especially who come to Israel and want to see a symbolic welcome to them as Reform Jews, as conservative Jews, as increasingly number of unaffiliated Jews. And Israel has to take some responsibility to make those Jews feel at home, because it's the Jewish state. Aleph Be Yehoshua, from the left, has a beautiful definition of Zionism. He said to be a Zionist means that, yes, Israel is a state of all its citizens, but it's also the homeland of the Jewish people. If you don't recognize that second part, he says, I can have coffee with you, I might like you, you're just not a Zionist. And if Israelis from right to left, religious, non-religious, take on that responsibility, they understand that they have to do some things, sometimes symbolically, sometimes substantively, to make our fellow Jews welcome. Not just have the handout, but to have the handout stretched in a hug.
And that's a beautiful segue to our Q&A segment. We have lots of questions here for you. So the first question is, can you explain why, even with the Abraham Accords, these same countries still vote against Israel in the United Nations and other international arenas? In other words, and I would add to that question, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who declined to speak at the Rabin Memorial because he wasn't pro-peace enough for her. So there are people that there's nothing that is enough for them. If you can explain that phenomenon.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the great American diplomat before he was a senator, who almost 45 years ago to this date, November 10th, 1975, got up in the General Assembly of the United Nations and defended the ugly charge of Zionism as racism, said, I don't care about the accused, I care about the accuser. Meaning, I'm not going to say what's wrong with the accused, I'm saying what's wrong with the accusers. And when someone like AOC says, I can't even show up to a Rabin memorial, and we start saying what's wrong with us, I say what's wrong with her. And you know what? I find it clarifying, because what she's really saying is that she looks at Israel as just unacceptable. So be honest. Don't come to our Rabin memorial and pretend. Be honest. I admire her honesty, even as I abhor her anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, but I see how trendy it is in her circles. And that's what scares me. Similarly, I understand, look, the Abraham Accords are new, and it's going to be a process. I would be surprised if within a couple of months, the whole framework of delegitimization, the whole network that has been built up in Arab country after Arab country of Jew hatred fell down. So yes, I could focus on the fact that the United Arab Emirates didn't vote right in the United Nations. I could also highlight the complete delightful irony that in Bahrain now there is an institute which has accepted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the international definition of anti-Semitism, which is based on delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. And the Federation in San Francisco rejected it. The Jewish Federation in San Francisco rejected it. So we have work to do on the Jewish side as well. Are the Abraham Accords perfect? No. Do we forget that the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan are dictatorships? Of course not. But are we all better off today than we were 4 months ago? When there's at least a shot at peace, when there at least are, you can see, you can feel the networks growing. You can see, you can feel the ties growing. That's how you make peace. You know, I'm not much of a sailor, but I know if I have to make a rope and I'm only gonna have one thin strand, which is what they try to do sometimes with the Oslo Accords, that can be cut. But if I have many strands and they're intertwined, political, cultural, diplomatic, academic, business, technology, medical, that's a strong rope. So it's a process.
We have several questions about the future of the Biden administration. So the first question is, there's several people asking the same question. There are alarming or disturbing signs, some statements made by Kamala Harris about restoring aid to the Palestinian Authority, reopening the U.S. consulate in Eastern Jerusalem, the PLO mission office in Washington, D.C. You mentioned the possibility of Biden administration rejoining the Iran pact. The question is, do we need to worry about that, or do you think this is something that is not going to significantly change American foreign policy in the Middle East?
Look, there's no doubt that if you narrow your perspective and only ask the question of Israel-US relations during the Trump era versus the Obama era, the gains that I mentioned at the beginning in the Trump era were significant, and the tension during the Obama era, and you were serving so honorably as a diplomat then, were intense. And Biden was a part of it, and the Democratic Party was a part of it. And so, yes, it's completely natural. Plus, Jews have Olympic gold medals in worrying. So it's perfect. It makes perfect sense to worry. But let's look at it also from two different perspectives. One, the challenge we have to make to the Biden administration is this. Let's quote Einstein. Einstein said the definition of insanity is making the same mistake again and again and again. And the definition of failure, of powerlessness, is having power and not being able to leverage it. Let's go back to that slide. If 68% of the Jewish community voted Biden-Harris, if, as we know, not just tens of millions, but hundreds of millions of Jewish dollars went to support Biden and Harris and the Democratic ticket up and down the slate, if right now in Georgia, there's a massive fight going on and tens of millions of Jewish dollars are coming in to try to make the Senate go Democratic, even though one of the Democratic candidates, Reverend Warnock, has said some very harsh things about Israel as an apartheid state. I'm putting in quotation marks, and birds of prey, comparing the IDF to birds of prey. We've got to call them out. We've got to leverage our power. If you donated money, if you voted for Joe Biden, you've got to use your voice. Don't sit there and go, oh, woe is me. That's not the American way, and it's not the Zionist way. Use your power. And if it's AIPAC, use it through AIPAC. If it's SHMAPAC, use it through SHMAPAC. Make up a different organization. I don't care. I'm not advancing an organization. I'm pushing a strategy. Don't sit in your chair and worry. And let's also be honest. For many, many Jews, the most important thing was getting rid of Trump. Trump has gotten the message. And the latest articles say he's understanding that he's got to leave. He lost by 5, 6, 7 million votes. We'll see in the final count, significantly. So for a time, American Jews put all their worries aside and they said, well, we've got to do whatever we can to get Trump out. Now that Trump's out, it's time to say, hey, wait a minute. This is an important issue. And let's be clear, this isn't just an issue for Jews. This isn't just an issue for Israel. This is an issue for a healthy democracy. The United States needs a healthy Israel, a strong Israel. The United States should understand that the most effective way to get Israel to go toward peace is through love. And the most effective way to get Palestinians to make some concessions is through tough love, not love. And Barack Obama's big mistake was he gave love to the Palestinians and tough love to the Israelis. He should have done the opposite. Donald Trump gave love to the Israelis and no love or anything to the Palestinians, and that was too much, and he got nothing in return. There's a balance, there's nuance. That's why we have experts like you who are diplomats and not bullying academics.
Well, I have to say that as a professional diplomat, I looked at what Donald Trump did really with wow, he basically broke all the basic assumptions of American foreign policy by saying no more even-handedness. He told the Palestinians, you broke it, you will pay for it. If you make mistakes, you're not going to be rewarded for it. Don't expect me to be, an honest broker, because there is no such thing. And I think that it was refreshing, I have to say. I never thought I would see this in my lifetime. An American foreign policy that is breaking away from even-handedness. But we are more likely to go back to even-handedness, and we'll see what happens. Now, you mentioned Birthright, Masa, and similar experiential programs as really the lifeline of the future of the emotional connection between North American Jewry and the State of Israel. And one of our listeners is asking a very important question. What do you think is the sustainable model for the future to keep those programs going forever? Because we know these are very costly programs.
So first, let me just go back quickly to your other point. We as parents know this. You have to teach kids a sense of responsibility. The most beautiful thing about the Zionist movement was we weren't trying to create perfection. We were just trying to take responsibility and solve pragmatic problems. The Palestinian nationalist movement has been the spoiled brats of nationalism. They give nationalism a bad name. They don't take responsibility. Once they start taking responsibility, once the international community in the United States starts saying, take responsibility, we will go forward. And responsibility, of course, is the key with Birthright and Masa and the Hebrew University Year in Israel programs. Yes, they are expensive, but we know how much, and let's also emphasize that the Israeli government pays a part of Birthright. And Masa comes from Israeli lands and JNF lands, and it's an extraordinary, that's proof, by the way, that Israel takes responsibility as the home of the Jewish people. And I'm not worried about the expense, because I also know that more and more Birthright returnees, Masa returnees, Hebrew University returnees, as they start earning, as they start building Jewish lives in Montreal and in Toronto, in Vancouver, in the United States of America, are going to start paying it back, what we could save and paying forward. And this is the beautiful model of the Jewish community. So I think look, ultimately, the power of Birthright, the power of Masa, the power of any of these programs is they light a spark within you. And the first time you come for free, the second time you come with your parents and grandparents or the backpack on your own. So yes, because of, let's be honest, the failures of most American Jewish parents, more so than Canadian Jewish parents, the failure of most American Jewish institutions, more so than Canadian Jewry is a much more rich, multidimensional, vigorous Jewish identity builder for many reasons. Birthright, Masa, many of these programs are expression of failures. They're expression of the fact that these kids have reached the age of 18 or 20 and they're nothings. And you know what, when they discover their Jewish identity and their Zionist identity, they also discover the power of identity in general, the power of freedom in general. I see it in their eyes. Natan Sharansky, with whom I wrote this new book, Never Alone, says, I see the same thing that people saw in our eyes as Soviet refuseniks. We had been refused identity. We were deprived of it by Stalin. These kids have been voluntarily deprived of it. And I see the same light in their eyes when you discover I'm a something, I'm not a nothing. I'm a part of this amazing story. And the more we share that, the less we worry about the money, because the money will flow, because the experience and the connectedness and the feeling, our book title, that you're never alone, flows as well.
Well, we'll get to the book before we end. I just wanted to ask you a question I should have asked you at the beginning. Tell us about your first time in Israel. What brought you to Israel, and what do you remember from that first visit?
Oh, that's a great question. So but, you know, everybody likes to talk about all the rich Jews of America. We were not New York Times Jews. We were New York Post Jews. My parents were New York City school teachers, very middle class. And I had never been on an airplane. And when it's time for my bar mitzvah, I had a choice. I could have one of those big parties, or we could spend the summer in Israel. And we flew. You're going to see how ancient I am. In 1974, first time I was on an airplane. And we went to Salma Chester School of Queens. And so one of the dads was part of El Al security, and he arranged to have a cake come for us, and we got a little bit of an upgrade. So we were like flying high. And I arrive in Israel, the land of our dreams. And I can't believe how primitive it is. We had rented an apartment in Herzliya, right? And we went to this makolet, and the bread isn't in plastic. Now, of course, that's a fancy, sexy thing because that shows it's more organic. But back then, it's wait a minute, doesn't it all come in Wonder Bread plastic? And we had those plastic salsalim that you had to put stuff in. We couldn't believe we had like gone back 20 years. And you know what we had in our suitcases? And again, my parents weren't wealthy. We had handkerchiefs and tablecloths and these amazing thing called calculators, because we were coming to our poor Israeli cousins to distribute as the rich Americans, despite the fact that we weren't rich. So that was one of my impressions. The other impression was just the magic of so I was bar mitzvah at the Kotel. We came for my bar mitzvah trip. I was bar mitzvah at the Kotel the day after Tisha B'Av. I remember being there Tisha B'Av and just seeing the massive Jews. I'd never seen dark-skinned Jews. Mizrahim just didn't exist in Queens in the 1970s. Jewish soldiers, Haredim, it was an amazing thing, and this amazing feeling of Jewish peoplehood. And this amazing feeling, I was always historically oriented, that I wasn't counting in decades, and I wasn't counting in centuries, I was counting in millennia. Wow, I was really swimming in history, and I haven't stopped swimming.
Amazing. And how many times have you been since then? You probably stopped counting.
Stop counting. Now where you live there, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem.
So tell us about the book. Natan Sharansky is someone I know very well, and tell us about the book.
So when I finished the book, The Zionist Ideas, I was quite exhausted. And I said, I want to take a year off from book writing because, you know, when you're writing a book, every morning you wake up, it's kind of like being a diplomat representing Israel. The burden is on your shoulder and the to-do list is always growing. But I'd also thought, who would be the perfect person to write the preface to a book, The Zionist Ideas? Natan Sharansky. So we had one of these crazy meetings where I sat with him. I had sent him an email asking him to write the preface. He had already decided in his mind. Now I know how he works. He'd already decided in his mind to say yes, but he hadn't told me. So we're having this meeting. He starts talking about his next book, how he wants to find a co-author. I'm like, where is this meeting going? And after an hour, I say, you know, Natan, will you write the preface? He goes, of course. He says, but will you be my co-author? Now, the one person in the world you can't say no to is Natan Sharansky, right? The KGB couldn't say no to him. How can Gil Troy say no to him? I've never written with anybody. I'm an academic. That means I don't get along with anybody. I play in my own sandbox. I wrote my own books. And I write about dead presidents and dead Zionists. What a privilege. What an opportunity. You know, sometimes you get to, I'm sure you've, in your experience, you get to know people behind the curtain, right? You see these big names and you get to know them personally. You go, huh, pretty disappointing. He and Avital are even better, more moral, more values-oriented, more rooted, more anchored than you would expect. Unbelievable people, really living their values then and now. And the name of the book is Never Alone. Why? The original book, we literally signed a book contract for $999. Why? Because he says, I was 9 years in Gulag, 9 years in Israeli politics, 9 years in Jewish agency. I don't know where I suffered most. And he says, actually, I do know where I suffered most, Israeli politics, which you'll understand. So we literally signed a book contract $999, but you can't have a book contract that it's a title that's an inside joke. I also worried about my Christian friends 999, 666, and my German friends 999. So I'm speaking with a friend of mine in Los Angeles, David Suissa, the extraordinary editor of the Jewish Journal. Well. I'm sure you do. Branding. This is a branding story, and I say I need a title. He says, well, tell me about the book. So, well, you know, one of the amazing stories is Natan again and again in the Gulag is told by the KGB, you're forgotten, you're abandoned, you're alone. And he says, even though I didn't get any visitors, even though I barely had any contact, I knew I was never alone. My people wouldn't abandon me. So he goes, that's it. For 75 years, we've been obsessed with never again. And of course, we honor the memory of our Holocaust martyrs. But now, what's the message to the next generation? When you're a part of this amazing network, when you're part of this amazing family, when you're part of this amazing story, you're never alone. Sometimes too much rain in your face, but where you're never alone. And it's so important for us. And so we call this book a manifestoir or a memoir festo. We use his life story to tell a broader story about Jewish peoplehood, to make a point about the need for us to stay together, even if we disagree, to have unity without uniformity, to keep the dialogue going, and to know wherever you are, whatever you do, when you're part of this conversation, you're never alone.
And it's a perfect high note to end this conversation. On that note, Professor Giltroy, I can't thank you enough. This was a fascinating discussion, and you really enriched our knowledge tremendously with U.S. politics, your understanding of Zionism, and of course, we can't wait to read your new book, Never Alone. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us, Professor Giltroy, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Amen, amen. And thank you for all the great work you do, Udo.
Thank you. Greetings to all of you from Jerusalem, and back to you, Dina, in Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ido Aharoni, for leading this fascinating conversation. And special thanks to you, Professor Giltroy, for sharing your insight and knowledge with us. Love your message about the interconnectivity in relationship, stop blaming, and start hugging. Israel diaspora. Now, most importantly, you, our audience, please join us next Sunday, 1 hour earlier than today, for a conversation with Mr. Sam Feldman. Thank you very much all. Have a good rest of the day and good evening to you in Israel. Goodbye.